What if the land where empires clashed, gods were worshipped, and one of the oldest civilizations was born, has been forgotten by history? For centuries, this narrow strip of land, between the great river of Egypt and the twin streams of Mesopotamia, was not only a crossroads of trade and culture, but a battlefield for gods, kings, and warriors. The kingdoms of ancient Canaan, rise, conflict, and legacy hold secrets long buried beneath the sands of time. But what do we truly know about the civilizations that once thrived here, shaping the destiny of 3 continents? Who were the Canaanites, and why does their legacy echo through the pages of both ancient history and the Bible? Today we embark on an extraordinary journey through time, unraveling the rise of powerful city-states, the unrelenting conflicts between empires, and the lasting legacy that has influenced religions, kingships, and civilizations to this very day. Will we uncover the mysteries that still haunt this ancient land, or will they remain locked away, lost to history? Let's find out. Before we dive in, a huge thank you to all our returning viewers. If you're here again, it means you've already caught a glimpse of the history we bring to life. You know how deep and immersive these stories are, and we're just getting started. If you're new, well, welcome to the journey of a lifetime. Don't miss out on more incredible content. Hit that subscribe button now, or risk missing out on the greatest history you've never been taught. Will we uncover the mysteries that still haunt this ancient land, or will they remain locked away, lost to history? Now, for those of you who somehow can't hit that subscribe button, feel free to enter the comments and let us know why. Is it because you prefer missing out on some of the most captivating stories ever told? Don't let regret haunt you later. Click subscribe now. Let's find out together. The ancient secrets of Canaan await. What if the crossroads of the ancient world was not just a land, but the cradle of human conflict, culture, and faith? What if this narrow strip of land between 2 great rivers held the secrets of empires, religious revolutions, and the rise of a civilization that would influence the world forever? The scene opens with a sweeping view of Canaan, the crossroads of 3 continents, Africa, Asia, and Europe. The camera soars over the Mediterranean coast, where trade routes stretched across the vast expanse of the ancient world. The land itself, a narrow strip between the great river of Egypt and the twin streams of Mesopotamia, was a strategic gateway for empires. The tension is palpable as we hear the hum of ancient voices. On one side, the Egyptians to the south established their power in Africa, while to the north, the Mesopotamians and later the Hittites fought for control over this prized land. This was not just geography, it was destiny. Egyptian records and trade treaties reveal how Egypt sought control over Canaan's trade routes. Pharaoh Thutmose III, in his military campaigns, expanded Egypt's borders into Canaan, asserting imperial dominance. The land, with its fertile plains and strategic position, was more than just a battlefield. It was a prize with the future of Egypt, Mesopotamia, and beyond intertwined within its borders. But even as mighty empires moved their armies through this land, Canaan itself was no simple prize. It was rich with resources, blessed with fertile land and strategic significance. The evidence of human presence in Canaan dates back to the early Bronze Age, where cities like Jericho, with its monumental walls, marked the rise of urban centers that would become the beating heart of trade and culture. As the camera dips below the surface of the hills, the focus shifts to the people of Canaan. Who were they, and what drove them to settle in a place that would witness endless cycles of conquest and resilience? Were they simply victims of history, or did they play a more active role in shaping the empires around them? The land that connected 3 continents held more than just trade routes. It held the promise of power. And as empires marched, a new people, driven by faith, survival, and ambition, began to rise. But who would control this coveted land? Who would hold the keys to history? The camera dives deep into the ancient city of Jericho, revealing the monumental walls that stood long before the rise of Israel. Massive fortifications, built not only for defense but to signify power, stand as an ancient testament to the early complexity of Canaanite civilization. These walls were more than just defenses. They were symbols of an emerging urban order, showcasing a society transitioning from nomadic existence to city-states with social hierarchies and intricate trade networks. Archaeological digs at Jericho reveal some of the oldest walls ever built, more than 10 meters thick. Excavations have uncovered ancient pottery, tools, and religious artifacts, all pointing to a rich and complex society. The walls not only kept invaders out but held within them the secrets of a thriving civilization, one that would lay the foundations for later empires. In cities like Hazor, the structures were not merely defensive but symbolized power, controlling vital trade routes that connected Mesopotamia with Egypt. These cities were not isolated but vibrantly connected to the greater world. Hazor's fortifications tell the story of a city built for defense but thriving in its trade relations, often dealing in olive oil, wine, and cedar wood, luxuries highly sought after by neighboring empires. But the tension grows. These city-states, despite their grandeur, were constantly at risk of invasion from external empires seeking to assert their own dominance. In this conflict-ridden landscape, alliances were as fleeting as the wind. But for every rise there was always a fall. Jericho's walls stood proud, but did they protect or did they imprison? As one kingdom rises, another threatens to fall. And as Canaanite cities began to flourish, a shadow began to emerge from the east. The screen darkens and we hear the eerie, haunting sound of ritual drums. A close-up reveals the high places atop mountain peaks, open-air sanctuaries where Canaanite priests performed rituals to appease their gods. These rituals, however, were not merely spiritual, they were political. The gods that Canaanites worshipped weren't just symbols of divine power, but tools of governance. The gods were intertwined with the cultural and political identity of the land itself. The Ugaritic texts reveal the names of the gods, like Baal and Asherah, who were worshipped at these sites. Temples were not just places of religious devotion. They were political centers where leaders sought divine favor to justify their reigns. The sacred rites, from fertility practices to child sacrifice, symbolized the interconnectedness of life and death, a belief deeply ingrained in the fabric of Canaanite society. The gods controlled not just the seasons and the crops but the very fate of cities. But not everyone was content with this system. As new invaders, like the Philistines, brought new deities, the religious landscape of Canaan began to fracture, sparking a crisis of faith that would shape the future of the region. In a land where the gods ruled, how much power did the kings have? Could these gods protect the Canaanites from the rising storm? And when the gods began to fail, who would rise to take their place? As the camera zooms over the shifting sands of the desert, the voice of the narrator carries a new weight. The tension of the story escalates. The Egyptian Tel Amarna letters tell a tale of desperation as Canaanite kings sent pleas for help to the pharaohs. Abdi-Heba, the ruler of Jerusalem, begged for Egyptian support against marauding invaders, knowing full well the political jeopardy his city faced under Egypt's imperial gaze. Egypt, ever the tactician, extended its reach into Canaan, but its control came at a cost: tribute, military service, and subjugation to Egypt's expanding empire. Pharaohs like Thutmose III and Ramses II left their mark on Canaan, both literally and figuratively. They built fortresses, set garrisons, and imposed their rule. But as Egypt moved northward, the question arises: was Egypt's control more fragile than it appeared? Could Canaan resist the pharaoh's iron grip, or were they simply puppets in Egypt's grand play for power? In the shadow of the pharaohs, a storm brews. The pharaohs of Egypt may have claimed dominion over Canaan, but could they control a land destined for rebellion? And as the pharaohs moved further north, what would they leave behind in their wake? The land where empires collided, gods were worshipped, and one of the most influential civilizations rose? Yet how much do we really know about Canaan? The land of Canaan, modern-day Israel, Palestine, and parts of Jordan, was more than just a narrow strip of land between the Nile River and the Euphrates. It was the crossroads of civilizations, the land that connected three continents: Africa, Asia, and Europe. This was a land that, due to its strategic location, became the prized possession of nearly every empire that came into contact with it, from the Egyptians to the Assyrians, the Hittites, and even the later Romans. The history of Canaan is not just the story of a single kingdom or a people. It is a story of trade routes, cultural exchanges, and battles for control that would reverberate through history for centuries. Imagine a land bridge, a narrow strip of fertile plains, mountains, and valleys where empires clashed and kingdoms rose and fell. The Egyptians, the Assyrians, and the Hittites all fought for control of this land because it was not only rich in resources, but it controlled access to the Mediterranean Sea, the Red Sea, and the Mesopotamian plains. Trade routes passed through its heart, linking the great civilizations of the ancient world. But beyond these practical considerations, Canaan was a land of spiritual significance, a place where ancient gods and deities were worshipped, and where some of the world's oldest cities were founded. Canaan's strategic importance was not just based on geography, it was shaped by its position as the bridge between two of the most powerful civilizations of the ancient world: Egypt to the south and Mesopotamia to the north. Over the centuries, it became a battleground, with these mighty empires fighting for control of its rich agricultural lands and its trade routes. The land's fertility was unmatched, thanks to its location between two major river systems, the Jordan River and the Nile. Canaan also had valuable resources including timber, copper, and later, iron. The desire for control of these resources, along with the strategic significance of the land as a crossroads, made it a focal point for empires seeking dominance in the ancient world. But who controlled this land first, before the empires arrived? What was life like before the battles for power began? Was Canaan always a crossroads, or did it have a singular identity of its own? Before the arrival of Egyptian pharaohs and the Assyrian warlords, Canaan was home to a unique culture, the Canaanites. The Canaanites were not a unified people, but rather a collection of city-states, each with its own ruler, gods, and culture. These city-states were connected by trade, but often engaged in conflict with each other. The earliest evidence of Canaanite civilization dates back to the early Bronze Age, around 3500 BCE, when the first fortified cities, like Jericho and Hazor, began to emerge. These cities were surrounded by massive walls, a reflection of the constant threat of invasion and intercity rivalry. Despite these challenges, the Canaanites built some of the world's first urban centers, and their society thrived through agriculture, trade, and craftsmanship. Before the Egyptians and the Assyrians arrived, Canaan was a land of small yet thriving city-states. The most famous of these early cities were Jericho and Hazor, which were not just settlements but centers of trade, religion, and culture. The Canaanites were skilled potters, metal workers, and merchants who traded goods from the Mediterranean to the Mesopotamian heartlands. But life in Canaan was far from peaceful. These cities, surrounded by walls as thick as 10 meters in places, were often in conflict with each other, fighting over resources, trade routes, and dominance in the region. The Canaanite religion played a crucial role in their society. It was a polytheistic belief system where gods like Baal, the storm god, Asherah, goddess of fertility, and El, the chief deity, were worshipped in high places, sacred locations often situated on mountain tops or elevated areas. These gods were believed to control every aspect of life, from the rain that nourished the crops to the fertility of animals and people. Religious rituals were an integral part of Canaanite society, and they included sacrifices, feasts, and ceremonial rites to ensure the favor of the gods. The Canaanites were also among the first to develop written language in the form of Proto-Sinaitic script, a precursor to the alphabetic systems we use today. The Canaanites had a rich and complex civilization. But what happened when these city-states came into contact with the mighty empires of Egypt and Mesopotamia? Would their culture survive, or would they be crushed under the weight of imperial ambition? As early as the 18th century BCE, the Egyptians and the Mesopotamians began to exert influence over Canaan, drawn to its resources, strategic position, and wealth. The Egyptians, under the New Kingdom circa 1550 BCE, considered Canaan a buffer zone between their empire and the rising powers in Mesopotamia. They imposed a system of tribute on the Canaanite city-states, demanding resources, luxuries, and military service in exchange for protection. The Egyptians also brought with them their culture, gods, and military strategies. The Hittites, to the north, also vied for control of the region, particularly for access to trade routes that connected Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, to Mesopotamia. As the Egyptians and Mesopotamians expanded their empires, they set their sights on the rich and strategically positioned land of Canaan. The Egyptians, under pharaohs like Thutmose III and Ramses II, sought to control Canaan as a military buffer zone against their Mesopotamian rivals. At the same time, the Hittites to the north saw the region as key to their own territorial ambitions. What followed was a game of power plays, with each empire trying to impose their will on the land and its people. The Canaanites, caught in the middle of these expanding empires, had no choice but to make deals, pay tribute, and sometimes fight to maintain their autonomy. During this period, Canaan saw the rise of fortified cities and complex trade networks, as the region became a crossroads for merchants, soldiers, and travelers. The Egyptians maintained military garrisons in Canaan, and the Tel Amarna letters, a collection of diplomatic correspondences from around 1400 BCE, reveal the complex relationships between the Canaanite city-states and their Egyptian overlords. Some kings were loyal, while others secretly plotted rebellion, hoping to break free from Egyptian domination. These internal divisions, combined with the external pressures from the Hittites and other regional powers, set the stage for the eventual collapse of Canaanite autonomy. The Egyptians and the Hittites each sought dominion over Canaan, but what would become of the Canaanites, caught between two of the ancient world's most powerful empires? Would they surrender their independence, or would they rise up and push back? The answer would come in a storm of invaders, the Sea Peoples, whose arrival would shake the foundations of Canaan's city-states. The arrival of the Sea Peoples, including the Philistines in the 12th century BCE, marked the final blow to Canaanite autonomy. With iron weapons and superior military tactics, the Sea Peoples wreaked havoc on Canaan's coastal cities, obliterating entire settlements and establishing the Philistine Pentapolis, the 5 cities of Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath. These invasions disrupted the Canaanite city-state system, forever altering the region's political and cultural landscape. In the midst of Egypt's decline and the rise of new powers in the east, a new wave of invaders arrived. The Sea Peoples, a mysterious coalition of maritime raiders, stormed the Mediterranean coast. Armed with iron weapons and battle tactics that the Canaanites had never seen, they destroyed cities, killed or displaced populations, and left the land in ruins. As the Philistines established their stronghold along Canaan's coastal plain, they redefined the region's power structures. What followed was a collision of cultures, where Canaanite traditions began to blend with Philistine influences, creating a new identity in the ancient world. The Sea People's invasion marked the end of the Canaanite city-state system and the beginning of a new era in the Levant. The Philistines, one of the Sea People's most prominent groups, brought iron technology with them, giving them a significant advantage over the Bronze Age Canaanites. As they settled in the coastal cities, they became one of Israel's most formidable enemies. Archaeological evidence from sites like Tel Ashkelon and Gath reveals distinctive Philistine pottery, architecture, and religious practices that differed from the Canaanites. This was a cultural revolution as the ancient world shifted in dramatic ways. With the Sea People's invasion, Canaan's once thriving cities fell into chaos, and the old order collapsed. But who were these invaders really? What drove them from the sea? And what would be left of Canaan after they swept through? The stage was set for the rise of Israel, but what did it mean for Canaan's ancient legacy? Before Israel rose, long before the grand temples of Jerusalem were built, there were walls, massive walls designed not just to protect but to define power. Canaan, modern-day Israel, Palestine, and parts of Jordan, was not always the battleground for empires that we often think of. In the early Bronze Age, it was a land teeming with small, independent city-states, each with its own identity, economy, and most importantly, its own defense system. Cities like Jericho, Hazor, and Megiddo were not merely settlements. They were fortresses designed to protect their people from external invaders, but also from one another. The early cities of Canaan were unlike any others in the ancient world. These were fortress cities built with walls so thick, some over 10 meters thick, that they were among the oldest and most impressive fortifications ever constructed. These monumental walls were more than just practical defenses against attack. They were symbols of power, wealth, and territorial control. What drove these ancient people to build such massive fortifications? Was it simply a desire to protect their wealth and resources, or was there something more profound behind it? The city-state system of Canaan began to emerge around 3500 BCE during the early Bronze Age, a period marked by growing social complexity, trade, and technological advances. Unlike other regions where cities were primarily built for agriculture or religious worship, the cities of Canaan were founded as strategic strongholds to control the flow of goods, ideas, and military power. Jericho, for example, with its massive walls, is often regarded as one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities in the world. Its defensive walls were a clear indication that the Canaanites, though a small population compared to the Egyptian and Mesopotamian empires, knew the value of protecting their resources. Hazor, located in the north of present-day Israel, became one of the largest and most powerful cities in Canaan, strategically positioned at the crossroads of trade routes. Its walls were not only intended for protection but also for asserting its control over the vast surrounding areas. But were these walls only designed to keep others out, or were they meant to keep something inside? At the heart of Canaan's city-state system lay the legendary city of Jericho, known for its massive and ancient defensive walls. These walls, constructed around 8000 BCE, make Jericho's fortifications the oldest known in the world. With walls so thick they could accommodate houses on top of them, Jericho's fortifications stood as a testament to the ingenuity and strategic foresight of its builders. But Jericho wasn't just about defense. It was the first true urban center in Canaan, and its walls represented the birth of an entire city-building culture. In the early days of Canaan, Jericho was the jewel of the ancient world. Its walls, constructed from mud brick and reinforced with stone foundations, were built not just for military defense but to demonstrate the city's dominance. These walls were thicker than anything the Egyptians or Mesopotamians had ever built at the time, a true engineering feat. Archaeological evidence suggests these walls were not only a defensive barrier but also a reflection of the prestige and status of Jericho. But as massive as these walls were, the question arises, What was the real reason for their construction? Was it to keep invaders at bay? Or was there something hidden behind these walls, something even the ancient builders wanted to keep out of view? The walls of Jericho are among the most significant archaeological discoveries in the world. Recent excavations show that these walls were not just practical barriers but also monumental structures that symbolized the city's importance in the ancient world. Jericho's location at the intersection of key trade routes made it a vital hub for commerce and culture. The city's wealth and trade, coupled with its strategic position, meant it was an essential site for defending trade routes and controlling the flow of goods and cultural exchange. Jericho's walls also served as a cultural boundary, symbolizing the city's place within the larger geopolitical landscape of the ancient world. Was Jericho's strategic significance enough to explain its walls, or was there something deeper, something spiritual and cultural, that compelled its builders to create such a formidable structure? What did these walls truly protect? The city of Hazor, one of the largest cities in Canaan during the Middle Bronze Age, is another example of the region's growing reliance on fortified cities. Unlike Jericho, Hazor was a sprawling metropolis, situated in the northern part of Canaan, near present-day Tel Hazor in northern Israel. Hazor's walls were not just designed to keep enemies out, they were a symbol of authority in a region of ever-present conflict. Its walls were wide, built from mud brick and reinforced with stone, standing as an imposing fortress that could repel any invader. While Jericho was the birthplace of defensive architecture, Hazor expanded on this concept, turning fortification into an art form. Hazor's walls were far more than military protection, they were tools of power. Enclosing the city in thick, stone-reinforced walls, Hazor's city planners transformed the entire urban landscape into a strategic stronghold, designed to assert dominance over the trade routes leading to Mesopotamia and the Egyptian territories. The walls of Hazor were not just about protection from invaders but about domination, providing the city-state with both military and economic strength. Yet, the question remains, why did these early city-states invest so much in these imposing defenses? The walls of Hazor were a reflection of the city-state's military and economic influence during the Middle Bronze Age. Hazor's position at the crossroads of the north-south and east-west trade routes made it a critical location for trade and cultural exchange. The city's size, along with its fortified nature, allowed it to maintain control over large portions of Canaan and surrounding regions. The fortifications of Hazor are evidence of the sophisticated urban planning that existed in Canaan even before the rise of larger empires like Egypt and Mesopotamia. Hazor's downfall, as recorded in the Bible, came with its conquest by Joshua, but its walls left behind a legacy of monumental architecture and strategic importance. Hazor's massive fortifications were a symbol of the city-state's power, but their ultimate fall to Joshua raises the question: were these walls truly impenetrable, or were they symbols of a decaying system, unable to withstand the growing pressures from new forces that would soon reshape Canaan's landscape forever? The walls of Canaan, from Jericho to Hazor and beyond, are not just physical remnants of a bygone era. They are markers of a deeper spiritual and cultural transformation that laid the foundation for future empires and kingdoms in the Levant. The practice of building monumental walls not only set the stage for the rise of Israel and the eventual establishment of Jerusalem as a fortified city but also influenced the way later civilizations, from the Romans to the Byzantines, would approach the idea of defense. The walls of Jericho, Hazor, and other ancient cities were more than just barriers to protect a population. They were statements of identity and authority. These walls embodied the desire for security, control, and power. They were symbols of a people's strength, resilience, and ambition, as they built not just to protect themselves but to define their place in a world teeming with competing empires. In the centuries that followed, These walls would become a blueprint for later civilizations, who would follow the same principles of fortification and defensive architecture. The walls of Canaan's cities had a lasting impact on ancient warfare and urban design. Even after the fall of the Canaanite city-states, the legacy of fortification influenced Israelite cities like Jerusalem, whose walls became symbolic not only of military defense but of the spiritual and political significance of the city. The idea of building walls to define territory would continue to be central in shaping the course of history in the Levant. Cities across the ancient world, from Babylon to Rome, borrowed from Canaan's blueprint, demonstrating the profound influence Canaan's defensive architecture had on future urban development. The walls of Canaan's cities were built to protect, to define power, and to symbolize a people's identity. But with each fallen city and with each new wave of invaders, the question remains: could these ancient fortifications ever truly protect what was inside, or were they doomed to fall like the civilizations they sought to preserve? Imagine this: the air heavy with incense, smoke rising from sacred altars, the chants of priests echoing across the mountainsides of ancient Canaan. Beneath a sky pierced by the blazing sun, the fire on the altar crackles, and the stone gods stand sentinel in silence, watching over the land. The sounds of drums beat, and the scent of burnt offerings fills the air, a world where the divine was as real as the earth beneath your feet. What was it that drove an entire civilization to believe that the gods, those fierce, powerful beings, could shape their very survival? How did a people living in the shadow of nature's most unpredictable forces come to worship gods of rain, fertility, and storms, in rituals so sacred that they would sacrifice everything to gain favor? What can we learn from the mysterious rites they performed on the mountaintops, far from the eyes of the common folk? Baal, storm god, lord of rain, the one who brought life to the crops and death to enemies. Asherah, goddess of fertility, her hands outstretched in love to the earth she nurtured. Enel, the father of the gods, the one who sat at the head of the pantheon, the god of creation, of order, of the heavens themselves. In the ancient Ugaritic texts, we see Baal depicted not just as a warrior god, but as the protector of the land. His myth is entwined with fertility rituals. His marriage to Asherah, the mother goddess, was believed to bless the earth with life. In these texts, Baal's power over the storm made him the most revered deity in Canaan, and Asherah's fertility ensured the survival of the people through the bounty of the land. El, the head of the pantheon, was a god of wisdom and law, the one who ruled over the cosmic balance, making Canaanite society function under his watchful eye. The gods were not just figures in the sky. They were alive in the hearts of the people, present in every rainstorm, every harvest, and in the pulse of life itself. They were the givers and takers of life, and their favor could either bless or destroy. But these gods, gods of fertility, of rain, of power, demanded something in return. What did they ask of their people? And more importantly, what was the cost of failing to appease them? The camera shifts to the mountaintop sanctuaries, sacred high places, where the veil between the heavens and earth is the thinnest. These were the temples where Canaanites offered their most precious possessions to the gods, where the earth met the sky. Atop the hills, where the gods could hear their every prayer, the people gathered. Here, rituals were performed not just to worship the gods, but to ensure the very survival of the community. But these were no simple offerings. No, in these high places, life and death were intertwined, where the line between sacred and profane blurred into something much more powerful. The practice of sacred prostitution was central to Canaanite fertility rites, as described in the Ugaritic texts. This ritual was not seen as sinful but as a sacred act, symbolizing the union of the earth and sky, of fertility and life. Archaeological findings from ancient Canaanite temples show altars with carved images of Baal, Asherah, and other deities, reinforcing the idea that these rituals were designed to sustain both the human race and the land itself. These sacred high places were more than just physical locations. They were gateways to the divine. Priests and priestesses acted as mediators between the gods and the people, their bodies, their actions, their words, all part of the divine dance to ensure life continued. But what were the limits of these rituals? What did the gods demand from their followers? And then came the darkest ritual of them all, the sacrifice that would come to define Canaanite spirituality in ways no one could imagine. But who was worthy of such an offering, and what could such a sacrifice cost? Among the most frightening rituals of the Canaanites was the belief that the gods demanded the ultimate sacrifice, the life of a child. But what would drive a civilization to sacrifice its own young? And how far could the gods' demands go before the very soul of Canaan was tainted by the fear of destruction? While biblical texts like those in the book of Jeremiah mention the practice of child sacrifice to Moloch, archaeological evidence from Carthage and other Canaanite sites suggests that it was not merely a myth. At Tophet in Carthage, excavations have revealed charred remains of infants, believed to have been sacrificed in times of crisis. These rites were likely meant to ensure the gods' favor during periods of famine, war, or natural disaster. But how widespread was this practice? And what was the true cost of these rituals? The rituals of child sacrifice may have been rare, but the fear they instilled in the hearts of the Canaanites was real. The gods were powerful, and their demands were not always easy to bear. Was it desperation, or was it something darker? The belief that only through the ultimate sacrifice could one ensure survival in a hostile world? These dark practices would eventually be challenged, but how long could Canaan hold on to its ancient beliefs before a new faith rose to change everything? As the power of the Canaanite cities began to wane under the pressure of invaders and internal strife, a new force began to take shape. The Israelites, emerging from within the very heart of Canaan, would wrestle with the gods of their forefathers. But how much of Canaan's religion would survive in the new faith of Israel? The Bible records how Israelite prophets like Elijah confronted the practices of Canaanite religion. The struggle between Baal worship and the worship of Yahweh was not just a theological battle, it was a political one. The Israelites, emerging from the Canaanite landscape, struggled with the temptation to embrace the old gods of their neighbors. Yet over time the influence of the Canaanite pantheon waned, and a new monotheistic faith began to take root. The gods of Canaan would eventually fade, replaced by a new faith, but the influence of Baal, Asherah, and El would never be entirely erased. They would live on in the whispers of ancient texts, in the bones buried beneath sacred altars, and in the land that had once worshipped them. And yet, as the new faith spread, was it enough to erase the deep-rooted power of Canaan's gods? Or did their legacy live on in unexpected ways, waiting to resurface when history would demand it most? Imagine the oppressive weight of an empire so vast, its shadow stretches from the heart of the Nile to the rocky hills of Canaan. Pharaohs like Thutmose III and Ramses II ruled not just with armies but with the suffocating power of fear, tribute, and control. But Canaan, the land between Egypt and Mesopotamia, refused to surrender its soul without a fight. The rise of Egypt as an imperial force was not merely about military conquest. Egypt's power was tied to its access to resources, its military innovations, and its extraordinary ability to project power beyond the Nile. As Egypt's pharaohs extended their reach, Canaan became a region caught in the crossfire, a land rich in resources strategically positioned, but also a fateful buffer between two great empires. From the expansive reign of Thutmose III, who invaded Canaan during his military campaigns, to Ramses II, the region would be forever scarred by Egypt's desire for control. The pharaohs of Egypt did not simply conquer Canaan, they bent its rulers to their will. Thutmose III, known as the Napoleon of Egypt, invaded Canaan over 16 times, his forces sweeping through the land with ruthless efficiency. By the time of Ramses II, Canaan was not just a territory under military occupation. It had become a vassal state, forced to send tribute and pay homage to Pharaoh's might. But what was the true cost of this conquest? And how far would the kings of Canaan go to protect their people from Pharaoh's iron grip? The Tel Amarna letters, written by Canaanite rulers to the Pharaoh, reveal the tension between submission and resistance. These ancient letters, like desperate cries from the cities of Jerusalem and Gaza, show that while they offered tribute, many Canaanite rulers were secretly plotting rebellion. They were caught between the deadly choice of revolt and surrender. Yet, despite their overt loyalty, did the Canaanite kings truly accept Egyptian domination, or was something more sinister unfolding behind the scenes? The pharaohs may have controlled the land, but could they control the hearts of the kings they ruled over? Pharaoh's control of Canaan was not just political, it was personal. Egyptian garrisons and military presence dotted the landscape of Canaan, turning the region into a militarized zone. Egyptian soldiers occupied Canaanite cities, acting as the pharaoh's enforcers, while the kings of Canaan, once independent rulers, were now vassals. Yet beneath the facade of tribute and obedience, the tension between oppression and desire for independence festered. The pharaohs didn't just leave their mark with gold and grain, they left behind a network of control. Garrisons were scattered throughout Canaan. Soldiers not only ensured that the taxes and tribute flowed into Egypt's coffers, but they also kept watch on the land. These soldiers controlled the gates, and Canaan's rulers knew that failure to comply meant imprisonment, death, or worse. Pharaoh's military garrisons were not mere symbols of power, they were the tool of subjugation, a physical reminder that Egypt's will was absolute. But within these walls of control, Canaan's rulers were not just subjects, they were trapped. Could their loyalty to Pharaoh really be trusted? And how long could they live with the constant fear of rebellion, of paying the price for the smallest defiance? Canaan's kings lived in a delicate balance. On one hand, their loyalty to Pharaoh, on the other, the longing for independence. The Tel Amarna letters detail this duality. On paper they are vassals. In secret, however, many Canaanite rulers were scheming to break free from Egypt's grasp, knowing that rebellion could bring swift retribution. The letters portray a people in oppression but also in hope, hoping for a chance to seize back their freedom. But as Canaan's cities cowered under the weight of Egypt's military, there were those who whispered of rebellion, of a rising force from within Canaan itself. The kings of Jerusalem, Gaza, and Hazor repeatedly petitioned Pharaoh, begging for his protection against rivals, but their true thoughts were far from loyal. They were, in essence, playing both sides. Resistance was in their hearts, but the constant pressure from Pharaoh's forces kept them from acting. The tension in these cities was palpable. The fear of rebellion was as real as the fear of Egyptian wrath. Still, the idea of resistance began to take hold. How long could the Canaanite kings endure this oppression? And would they rise together to break free, or would they remain shackled by Pharaoh's demands? Did the kings of Canaan silently plot behind Pharaoh's back, or were they too afraid to defy the empire? What were the true motivations of the leaders who swore loyalty yet secretly dreamed of freedom? Though Egypt eventually withdrew its direct military presence from Canaan, the legacy of its rule left an indelible mark on the region. Egypt's gods, art, and administrative systems persisted long after the pharaohs were gone. The culture of Egypt, its temples, its military innovations, its cosmology, was absorbed into Canaanite society, becoming a lasting influence on the land. The pharaohs may have retreated, but their footprints remained, woven into the very fabric of Canaanite society. Egyptian art, culture, and even military tactics were adopted, with Canaanites continuing to use Egyptian-style pottery, architecture, and religious symbols in their cities long after the pharaoh's garrisons had left. Pharaoh's gods, especially Baal, Asherah, and El, remained deeply embedded in the spiritual life of Canaan. Even as Canaan was pulled toward new powers, Egypt's imprint continued to be seen, echoing through the temples and royal courts of Canaan. But what did this lingering Egyptian influence mean for Canaan's future? Could Egypt's imprint survive the rise of new powers? Was Canaan destined to remain in the shadow of Egypt, or would it break free and find its own identity? The greatest empire in the Mediterranean was brought to its knees not by a mighty army, but by a people who came from the sea, with iron swords and a reckless fury that would change Canaan forever. They were the sea peoples, and among them, the Philistines would rise to become the architects of destruction, their mastery of iron weapons rewriting the laws of war and survival in the ancient world. At the dawn of the 12th century BCE, the world saw the first signs of an unprecedented upheaval. Across the Mediterranean, the mighty civilizations that had thrived for centuries, the Egyptians, Hittites, and Mycenaeans, were suddenly brought to the brink of collapse. In their wake, a mysterious confederation of invaders emerged from the sea, people whose names and origins have been the subject of intrigue for centuries. The Sea Peoples, a name that has echoed through history, wreaked havoc across the Mediterranean coastline, but it was the Philistines among them who would carve out a place in Canaan that would last for generations. Who were these Sea Peoples? Where did they come from? And what brought them and their terrifying iron weapons to Canaan? To understand their success, we must first look at the mystery of their origins. The Sea Peoples are believed to have come from a variety of regions, ranging from the Aegean to the Anatolian Peninsula, and even as far as the central Mediterranean. The most important group, however, was the Philistines, who eventually settled in the coastal cities of Canaan. The Philistines were different. Their rise was not based on political alliances or superior numbers. It was based on technology. The Sea Peoples had one weapon in particular that the ancient world had never seen before: iron. Their use of iron weapons and tools was revolutionary, and in a world still dominated by bronze, their superior strength and sharpness gave them an almost unbeatable edge. Iron swords, armor, and tools would give them the ability to destroy and conquer cities with a force that was previously unimaginable. Archaeological evidence from the Philistine city of Ashkelon, excavated by scholars in the late 20th century, reveals the advanced ironworking techniques they possessed. They crafted iron swords that were far more durable than the bronze blades of their enemies. Egyptian inscriptions and Hittite records also describe the Sea Peoples as having unmatched skill in shipbuilding and maritime warfare, allowing them to traverse the Mediterranean with devastating precision. The Philistines' iron technology was not just a military advantage, it was a weapon that redefined warfare in the ancient world. But the Sea Peoples' mastery of iron was just one part of their success. There was another, more sinister reason they were able to conquer Canaan, and the answer lies in their tactics and the way they approached battle. What was it about the way the Philistines fought that made them so dangerous? The Philistines didn't just invade Canaan, they decimated it. In the span of a few years, they systematically destroyed the Canaanite city-states, tearing through coastal strongholds with brutal efficiency. The Canaanite cities, once powerful and proud, stood no chance against the Philistine invasion. The camera zooms in on the ruins of these cities, where the remnants of stone walls and fortified gates tell the story of a devastating war that changed the course of history. In just a few decades, the Philistines managed to topple the great coastal cities of Canaan, such as Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath. These cities were once the heart of Canaan's political and cultural life, but they crumbled under the weight of Philistine weapons and military superiority. The Philistines' ability to build fortified cities that could withstand siege was a game-changer. With the fortress at Gath as the center of their power, they fortified their cities with massive walls that were nearly impregnable. In fact, the walls of Gath were among the most impressive military structures of the era, designed to defend against enemies who had no answer to the new Philistine weaponry. Archaeological excavations at Philistine sites like Gath and Ashdod show the fortifications and military installations they built. Iron tools, including blades, axes, and tools for siege warfare, have been uncovered in these sites. These findings suggest that the Philistines were not only advanced in their weaponry but also had a deep understanding of military strategy. They used their superior iron technology to create tools that could break through the stone walls of Canaanite cities, giving them an advantage no one could match. The Canaanite city-states fell one by one, but their defeat wasn't the end of the story. The Philistines had done what no other invader could. They had reshaped the political and military landscape of the region. But what came next for them? Would they continue to dominate the land they had conquered, or were they now vulnerable to new threats? By 1000 BCE, the Philistines had firmly established themselves in Canaan, forming the Philistine Pentapolis, a league of 5 cities: Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath. These cities became the heart of the Philistine culture, and their military and economic power spread throughout the region. But even as they grew stronger, the question remained: how long could the Philistines maintain their grip on Canaan before new powers began to challenge their authority? The Philistines' success was built on their iron weapons, their fortified cities, and their ability to adapt to the challenges of conquest. In just a few short years, they had transformed the landscape of Canaan, establishing a new order. The Philistine Pentapolis, with its network of fortified cities, created a power block that allowed them to dominate the region for centuries. But as the Philistines grew in power, they also attracted new rivals, and it would not be long before they faced new threats from beyond their borders. The Philistine Pentapolis wasn't just a group of cities, it was a strategic network. Gaza, the southernmost city, controlled the trade routes between Egypt and the rest of the Levant, while Ashkelon and Ashdod were vital centers for maritime trade. Archaeological evidence shows that these cities were heavily fortified and militarized, with iron weapons used in defensive structures and siege warfare. The Philistine economy thrived on the trade of goods like wine, olive oil, and textiles, all of which were produced in these coastal cities and traded with Egypt, the Aegean, and Mesopotamia. However, despite their rise to power, the Philistines had their enemies, and their dominance was about to be challenged. Could they survive the new powers that were beginning to emerge on the horizon? And what role would Canaanite resistance play in the Philistine downfall? By 900 BCE, the Philistines had reached the peak of their power in Canaan. Their cities flourished, and their influence spread through trade, culture, and military dominance. Yet, with the rise of new powers such as the Israelite monarchy, the Philistine grip on the region was starting to weaken. The once unassailable invaders now found themselves on the defensive, facing enemies who were adapting and learning from their military strategies. Though the Philistines held on to their cities for centuries, their legacy in Canaan was not one of eternal dominance. The Israelites began to rise in power, and by the time of King David, the Philistine stronghold in the south was under threat. It was not a military force that would challenge the Philistines, but the resilience of the people they had conquered. David's victories against the Philistine giants, including the famous battle with Goliath, signaled the start of a new era in Canaan, one in which the Philistines would be pushed back by forces they had once dominated. The Philistine dominance would eventually come to an end, but their iron weapons, their fortifications, and their legacy would echo through the region. As the Israelites rose to power, would they overcome the Philistine threat and reclaim Canaan for themselves? What does it take for a small band of nomads to become the most powerful kingdom in the region? A kingdom capable of wielding military might, commanding divine favor, and uniting warring tribes under a single banner? The answer begins with one name, David. For centuries, the Israelites existed as a confederation of tribes, each with its own leader, its own culture, and its own traditions. The unity of Israel was fragile, torn by infighting, external threats, and internal divisions. The time of the Judges, a period defined by decentralized authority, was one of chaos and struggle, a time when Israel was besieged by external enemies like the Philistines and plagued by internal turmoil. Israel was a land of disparate tribes, each living within its own borders, each with its own traditions. The Israelite confederacy was held together by rituals and loyalties, but unity was always on the edge of collapse. No one could agree on how to handle the Philistine threat, and the judges, the leaders chosen for their wisdom and charisma, could not unite the people into a single cohesive nation. It was a time of war, of desperation, and of yearning for a strong leader who could command the respect of all tribes. The book of Judges paints a bleak picture of Israel during this period. The tribes were often isolated and caught in conflicts with their neighbors, including the Ammonites, Moabites, and Philistines. The Israelites' lack of central authority made them vulnerable to raids and military incursions from all sides. The judges, leaders like Deborah, Gideon, and Samson, provided leadership during times of crisis but were not able to unite Israel into a single, centralized kingdom. The Philistine invasion in the 12th century BCE highlighted the need for stronger, more organized leadership. But in the shadows of the tribal disputes and military defeats, a new leader was emerging, a man whose reputation would turn the tide in Israel's struggle for unity. David, the humble shepherd, was about to become the force that would shape Israel's destiny. But was he truly the chosen king, or was he merely a warrior with ambition and skill? In the fields of Bethlehem, a young shepherd named David tended his father's flocks. At first glance, David seemed an unlikely candidate to become the king of Israel. He was the youngest of 8 brothers, a simple shepherd, and his family was of little importance in the grand political landscape of ancient Israel. But David's rise was not due to noble blood or political alliances. It was born from his skills as a warrior and his divine favor. David's journey from a humble shepherd to the future king of Israel began not on a battlefield but in the fields of Bethlehem. He was anointed by Samuel, the prophet, as the future king of Israel, but his path was far from simple. Saul, the reigning king, was initially unaware of David's potential. David's first act of fame came in the form of a legendary battle, the victory over the Philistine giant Goliath. The story of David and Goliath is one of the most iconic in biblical history, but there is more to this battle than meets the eye. The Philistines, armed with iron weapons, had been harassing Israel for years. The Israelites, still armed with bronze, were at a significant disadvantage. Enter David, armed with only a sling and a stone, who boldly accepted Goliath's challenge, defeating the giant with a single stone to the forehead. This stunning victory turned David into a national hero, cementing his reputation as a warrior capable of great things. David's victory over Goliath was just the beginning. But as he gained fame and support among the Israelites, King Saul's jealousy began to fester. Was David's rise a divine act, or was it the ambition of a young warrior who would stop at nothing to claim the throne? What dark secrets did David harbor, and how far would he go to seize the power he had been promised? As David's fame grew, so did the paranoia of King Saul. Saul, who had once welcomed David into his court, now saw him as a threat to his throne. The rivalry between Saul and David became intense, and David found himself fleeing for his life, wandering through the wilderness of Judea and Israel, pursued by the jealous and increasingly unstable King Saul. David's rise to power was not without sacrifice. As his reputation spread, so did King Saul's jealousy. Once David became a military leader in Saul's army, Saul's paranoia grew. The people of Israel praised David for his victories, but Saul, consumed by envy, saw only a rival. Saul's attempts to kill David were relentless, forcing David into exile. The wilderness became David's home, and his band of followers grew. But with every passing day the question lingered: would Saul's jealousy eventually lead to David's death, or was the young warrior's destiny truly inevitable? Saul's mental state deteriorated, and his jealousy of David's success became a driving force in the political crisis of Israel. David's exile was marked by both hardship and opportunity. During this period, David built a following of men who were loyal to him, and he became a military leader in his own right, leading raids against Israel's enemies and building alliances with local leaders. David's leadership was not defined by royalty or birthright but by his ability to inspire loyalty and his warrior skills. David was not alone in his exile. He had loyal followers who believed in his cause, but the road to the throne was fraught with danger. As Saul's grip on Israel weakened, David's time to claim the throne was fast approaching. But would David's loyalty to his people and his belief in his destiny lead to his triumph? Or would it be his darkest hour that ultimately transformed him into the king he was destined to be? In the final years of Saul's reign, the kingdom of Israel was on the brink of collapse. The Philistines had once again risen to power, and Saul, now a broken king, faced the might of their armies at Mount Gilboa. It was here that Saul's tragic end would be sealed, but it would also be the moment that David would rise to power and become the king of Israel. Saul's final battle at Mount Gilboa was not just a loss of men, but the final act in a tragic downfall. The battle was fierce, and the Philistines proved too strong for Saul's forces. In a final act of desperation, Saul took his own life. His death marked the end of an era, but it also opened the door for David's ascension. David, now a seasoned warrior and respected leader, was ready to take the throne he had been promised years before. After Saul's death, David returned to Israel and was anointed king by the tribe of Judah. Over time he was accepted as king by the rest of Israel, uniting the northern and southern tribes. David's military victories over the Philistines solidified his position, and he established a new capital in Jerusalem, which would become the center of Israel's political and religious life. David's reign marked the beginning of a golden age for Israel, as he built a unified kingdom and expanded its borders. David had risen from the humble beginnings of a shepherd to become the king of Israel, but his journey was far from over. What would his reign bring? Would he be the ruler who united Israel under the banner of peace, or would his own ambition and secrets tear the kingdom apart from within? You're here learning about one of the most monumental shifts in history, the rise of Israel and the birth of an empire. But if you leave without subscribing, you might miss the next chapter of this journey, the untold secrets and hidden truths that will be uncovered only here. Are you really willing to risk missing out on a story that's been over 1,000 years in the making? If you're not subscribed, think about why you'd want to walk away from history's most thrilling revelations. Let us know in the comments section why you're not subscribing, because we know you're not ready to let this moment slip through your fingers. You don't want to be the one who regrets not hitting that subscribe button when the next chapter unfolds. What if the wealth and wisdom that defined Israel's golden age also contained the seeds of its destruction? At the start of Solomon's reign in 970 BCE, Israel was a young nation, still shaped by the legacy of his father, David, the warrior king. David had established Israel as a unified kingdom, but it was Solomon, his son, who would transform it into an empire. Solomon's reign would become synonymous with the golden age of Israel, a time of prosperity, trade, and unprecedented peace. The kingdom was no longer just a regional power, it was a force to be reckoned with in the ancient world. When Solomon ascended to the throne, Israel was a nation poised at the crossroads of greatness. His reign, which lasted for over 4 decades, would see Israel at its most prosperous, an empire united under a wise and diplomatic ruler. Solomon's wisdom, a gift granted to him by God, became the cornerstone of his rule. His diplomatic acumen, military strategies, and religious reforms set Israel on a path to greatness that few could have foreseen. Solomon was not just the heir to David's throne. He was the man who would cement Israel's place in history. Unlike his father, who had fought wars of conquest, Solomon's reign was marked by peace. Solomon's wisdom, especially in matters of statecraft, enabled him to forge alliances with neighboring kingdoms and secure a truce with Israel's enemies. One of his most significant achievements was his marriage to Pharaoh's daughter, a strategic alliance that paved the way for trade and cultural exchange with Egypt, the dominant power of the time. Through Solomon's diplomacy, Israel became a hub of trade, linking the Mediterranean world to the Arabian Peninsula. He established a vast network of trade routes, and Israel became a key player in the exchange of goods, ideas, and cultural practices. In particular, the Phoenicians, famous for their seafaring and trading expertise, were key allies of Solomon, providing Israel with the materials to build his grand projects, including the Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem. Solomon's reign was one of unparalleled peace and prosperity. But the very alliances that gave him strength would eventually lead to division. Could Solomon's wisdom, the cornerstone of his success, withstand the pressures of his indulgence and the shifting dynamics of a changing world? One of the most iconic achievements of Solomon's reign was the construction of the Temple in Jerusalem, a symbol of Israel's divine favor and national unity. Solomon's temple was not just a religious center. It was the centerpiece of his empire, representing the power and wealth of his kingdom. The temple itself was a marvel of ancient architecture, built using the finest materials and craftsmanship available in the ancient world. Solomon's temple, constructed from the finest cedar wood from Lebanon, gold from the farthest corners of the known world, and intricate stone carvings, stood as a testament to Israel's growing power. The Ark of the Covenant, a sacred relic believed to house God's presence, was housed within the temple, solidifying the belief that Solomon's rule was divinely ordained. The grandeur of the temple mirrored the great wealth that flowed into Israel during Solomon's reign. The Temple of Solomon was more than just a place of worship. It was a political statement. By building the temple, Solomon united the tribes of Israel under a shared spiritual identity. The temple's construction required an enormous labor force, including skilled craftsmen from Tyre and Phoenician merchants who provided the materials necessary to complete the grand project. The construction of the temple also led to an economic boom in Israel. Solomon's kingdom became a vital trading partner for Egypt, Phoenicia, and other neighboring regions. Israel's wealth surged as Solomon expanded the tax base, implemented trade routes, and taxed the tribute paid by his allies. Goods such as spices, gold, olive oil, and wine flowed into Israel from every corner of the known world. Solomon's court was one of the wealthiest and most sophisticated in the ancient world, attracting diplomats, traders, and philosophers from distant lands. But the very wealth that Solomon accumulated, the luxury and the excess, would eventually sow the seeds of his empire's downfall. For every moment of prosperity came a moment of temptation, and indulgence in luxury often carries the price of division. Solomon's reign was marked by his strategic alliances with powerful kingdoms, including Egypt and the Phoenicians. While these alliances brought wealth and military security, They also introduced new cultural influences that would later challenge Israel's unity. The luxury that Solomon enjoyed came at a cost. A growing dependency on foreign powers both in terms of trade and military protection. The power of Solomon's kingdom did not exist in isolation. It was built upon alliances with the neighboring Phoenicians and Egyptians, who provided Israel with essential resources, technologies, and defense. Solomon's collaboration with King Hiram of Tyre led to the construction of the temple, and Egyptian trade brought Israel luxury items from the pharaoh's court. However, these alliances, forged in wisdom, also introduced a new set of challenges. Solomon's marriage to Pharaoh's daughter symbolized the deep integration between Israel and Egypt, but it also weakened the kingdom's spiritual purity. Solomon's embrace of foreign gods and religious practices began to sow discord within his people. Solomon's policy of marriage alliances, particularly with foreign royalty, was meant to secure peace and consolidate power. However, these marriages were not merely political. They brought with them the gods and customs of Egypt and other foreign lands. Solomon's foreign wives introduced worship of foreign deities, such as Ashtoreth and Molech, into Israel. This religious syncretism began to undermine the faith in Yahweh, and tensions arose among the Israelites who felt their spiritual purity was being threatened. Solomon's ability to balance these foreign influences with his divine calling would come to define his later reign. As Solomon basked in the glory of his empire, the cracks were beginning to appear. Tensions simmered beneath the surface. Was Solomon's wisdom enough to ensure Israel's future, or had he, in his pursuit of luxury and expansion, set the stage for the kingdom's destruction? Solomon's golden age would not last forever. After his death in 931 BCE, his son Rehoboam took the throne. But the luxuries that Solomon had indulged in, his marriages, his alliances, his building projects, became the burden of his successors. The heavy taxation and forced labor Solomon had imposed on his people led to discontent, and Rehoboam's harsh policies further alienated the 10 northern tribes of Israel. As Solomon's empire began to crumble, the divisions that had long simmered beneath the surface erupted into full-blown civil war. Rehoboam, Solomon's son, lacked his father's wisdom and foresight. The taxes and forced labor that had funded Solomon's grand projects, the temple, the palace, the military, became an unbearable burden on the people. The tribes of Israel, who had been unified under Solomon's rule, were now divided. The kingdom of Israel split in two, the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. Rehoboam's failure to relieve the burden of Solomon's heavy taxes led to the division of the kingdom. The northern tribes, led by Jeroboam, rebelled, forming the kingdom of Israel, while Judah, the southern kingdom, remained loyal to the Davidic line. The luxuries Solomon had indulged in, the lavishness of his court, and the foreign alliances he forged, these became the scars on Israel's future, marking the end of the Golden Age. The kingdom was fractured, and tensions between the two kingdoms would persist for centuries. The Golden Age had ended. What began as a promising empire under Solomon's leadership quickly descended into division and discontent. Solomon's legacy was now a kingdom split in two. Could Israel ever recover from the choices Solomon had made, or was the kingdom doomed to live in the shadow of its former glory? In the blink of an eye, Israel went from unity to chaos. How did a unified kingdom, a powerful empire under King Solomon, split into two bitter rivals, destined to tear at each other's throat for centuries to come? The death of King Solomon in 931 BCE marked the end of Israel's Golden Age, an age of peace, prosperity, and cultural flourishing. Solomon's wisdom had held the kingdom together for over 4 decades, transforming Israel into a rich and powerful empire. His achievements were nothing short of spectacular: the construction of the temple in Jerusalem, vast trade networks, and alliances that stretched across the ancient world. Yet, beneath this prosperity simmered a growing dissatisfaction. Solomon's death brought Israel's glory to an abrupt halt. The kingdom, once unified under one powerful king, faced a succession crisis. Solomon's son, Rehoboam, ascended to the throne, but he was not the wise and politically astute ruler his father had been. Rehoboam's inexperience and harsh policies would ignite a firestorm that shattered the kingdom's unity. Rehoboam's failure to ease the burdens of Solomon's heavy taxes and forced labor would spark a rebellion in the northern tribes, leading to the split of the kingdom and the creation of two rival states, Israel in the north and Judah in the south. The kingdom of Israel had been forged through years of struggle and conquest under Saul and David, with Solomon inheriting a powerful, unified state. But Rehoboam's inability to balance the heavy taxes imposed by his father led to discontent among the northern tribes. The northern tribes, led by Jeroboam, rejected Rehoboam's rule and formed their own kingdom, Israel, while Rehoboam retained control over Judah, the southern kingdom, which included Jerusalem. This division wasn't just political. It was religious, cultural, and economic, with Israel and Judah now as separate entities, each vying for power and survival. Israel, with its capital at Shechem, modern-day Nablus, West Bank, was larger and more fertile, while Judah, with Jerusalem as its capital, had a deeper religious connection to the heritage of King David. The seeds of division had been planted. Israel and Judah were now divided kingdoms, each seeking its own survival in the face of growing external threats. But the question remained, could Israel and Judah ever have stayed united, or was their division inevitable? After the split, Israel and Judah took dramatically different paths. Israel was led by a series of kings, many of whom were self-interested, power-hungry, and religiously corrupt. Israel's capital, Shechem, was eventually replaced by Samaria, a city strategically located on a hill, providing natural defenses and a strong military presence. But despite its military and strategic advantages, Israel found itself embroiled in internal conflicts, assassinations, and a steady decline in political stability. In the wake of Israel's division, the northern kingdom, Israel, found itself caught in a web of political instability. The very nature of the split created a rift in governance. Israel's rulers were often embroiled in coup attempts and bloodshed, with no ruler managing to maintain a long reign. Jeroboam, the first king of Israel, established new worship centers at Dan and Bethel in an attempt to create religious independence from Judah's Jerusalem temple. This religious shift would set the stage for centuries of spiritual conflict, with Israelite kings regularly falling into idolatry, worshipping gods like Baal and the golden calves, as they strayed further from their covenant with Yahweh. Jeroboam initiated the establishment of rival sanctuaries in the northern kingdom to keep his people from traveling to Judah for religious worship. This religious division would weaken Israel's spiritual foundation, while Judah remained loyal to the Davidic line and the temple in Jerusalem. Israel, with its polytheistic worship and idolatry, began to drift further away from the central Yahwist faith, and the kingdom was plagued by civil unrest and military defeats. Meanwhile, in Judah, though there were also periods of corruption, the kingdom remained focused on its monotheistic faith and its connection to the Davidic dynasty, which was still viewed as the rightful heir to Israel's throne. Israel's collapse was brewing, but Judah was not immune to the forces of corruption and political instability. While Israel struggled with internal strife, Judah's Davidic monarchy seemed to promise stability. But would Judah be able to maintain its grip on the throne, or would it be dragged down by the same forces that destroyed Israel? Unlike Israel, Judah retained a more stable monarchy through the Davidic line. However, Judah faced its own challenges in this divided world. Under King Rehoboam, Judah faced external threats and internal challenges. Yet it was the reigns of later kings like Asa, Jehoshaphat, and Hezekiah that truly showed Judah's resilience. Despite constant pressure from Israel's rivalry and the looming threat of Assyria, Judah was able to maintain its sovereignty for a time. Judah's survival was defined by its ability to adapt and innovate. While Israel's rulers were often weak and disjointed, Judah's kings took a more religious approach to governance. King Asa, for example, reformed the religion of Judah, removing idols and cleansing the Jerusalem temple of foreign gods. His reforms strengthened Judah's spiritual foundation, but it was King Hezekiah who would face the most terrifying test of Judah's survival. When the mighty Assyrian Empire came knocking at Judah's doors, Hezekiah had to rely on his faith and diplomatic maneuvering to save his people from annihilation. While Israel fell prey to Assyria, Judah survived through religious reforms and by appeasing powerful neighbors. Hezekiah's reign marked a pivotal moment for Judah's survival. In 701 BCE, the Assyrian king Sennacherib laid siege to Jerusalem, but Hezekiah's prayers and strategic alliances helped Judah withstand the attack. This miraculous survival would later be cited as divine intervention in biblical texts, portraying Hezekiah as a righteous king who relied on Yahweh for deliverance. But Judah's survival was only temporary. Israel had already fallen to Assyria, and the division of the kingdom was now irreversible. Would Judah too fall to the Assyrian war machine, or would it outlast the fate that had befallen its northern neighbor? In 722 BCE, the fate of the northern kingdom of Israel was sealed. After years of infighting, Assyrian expansion into the Levant, and military failure, Israel fell to the might of the Assyrian Empire. The northern tribes, once united under Jeroboam, were scattered, their cities destroyed and their people exiled. The 10 lost tribes of Israel vanished into history, never to return as a unified kingdom. The mighty Assyrian Empire, under King Shalmaneser V and his successor Sargon II, overwhelmed the northern kingdom. Samaria, Israel's capital, fell after a 3-year siege, and its population was deported and scattered across the Assyrian Empire. This marked the end of Israel as a unified kingdom. The once proud kingdom of Israel, its cities filled with wealth and power, was now a memory, its people lost to time and exile. The fall of Israel to Assyria is one of the most significant moments in the ancient Near East. The Assyrian records describe the fall of Samaria, marking the end of the northern kingdom and the beginning of Israel's exile. Assyrian deportation policies were ruthless, with entire populations forcibly relocated to distant parts of the empire to break their ties to their homeland. Israel's fall is not only a military defeat but also a cultural and spiritual one, as the 10 lost tribes were assimilated into the Assyrian Empire and vanished from history. Israel's fate had been sealed by Assyria, but Judah still stood. With Assyria now the dominant power in the region, what would become of the southern kingdom? Could Judah survive, or would it fall just as Israel had? What happens when an unstoppable empire comes to take everything you've ever known? The answer lies in the ruins of a kingdom, an empire that eradicated a people, scattered their families, and erased their name from history. The Assyrian Empire, under the leadership of King Tiglath-Pileser III and his successor Sargon II, was an ancient military powerhouse. By the late 8th century BCE, Assyria had perfected the art of conquest, not just through battle but through systematic domination. Their empire stretched across the Fertile Crescent, reaching from modern-day Iraq to parts of Turkey, Syria, and Iran. Assyrian kings, known for their ruthless tactics, left behind records of destruction that read more like threatening bullet points than annals of history. At the dawn of the 8th century BCE, the Assyrians were more than just a military force. They were a juggernaut, systematically dismantling anything that stood in their path. Their war machines, armed with iron weapons and led by ruthless commanders, moved like a storm across the ancient world. Assyria didn't just conquer land, they leveled cities, relocated populations, and imposed their will through a brutal mix of terror and assimilation. The northern kingdom of Israel, already weakened by internal strife and idolatry, would soon find itself at the mercy of this unstoppable force. By 740 BCE, the northern kingdom of Israel had been significantly weakened by political instability and internal divisions. The reign of King Pekah in Israel was marked by persistent conflicts with both Judah to the south and the Syrians to the north. This made Israel a perfect target for Assyria, whose imperial ambitions were sweeping the region. Tiglath-Pileser III had already begun his campaigns of conquest, annexing neighboring territories, and Israel's inability to unite under a single, strong ruler made it vulnerable to the impending Assyrian onslaught. Could Israel have resisted the Assyrians if they had been united? Or was the kingdom's fall inevitable, a result of internal divisions and external pressures? As Assyria marched forward, they would leave more than destruction. They would erase Israel from the pages of history. But did Israel's people simply vanish, or did they leave behind a legacy that would one day resurface? The Assyrian conquest of Israel reached its climax in 722 BCE, when the Assyrians laid siege to Samaria, the capital of Israel. For 3 long years, the city held out under the constant pressure of Assyrian forces, who used advanced siege tactics that included siege towers, ramps, and advanced archery. Samaria's walls, once thought impenetrable, were slowly breached as the Assyrian war machine, relentless and overwhelming, ground down the defenders. For 3 years, Samaria resisted. But no matter how stubborn the defenders, no matter how fierce the swordplay of Israel's warriors, the Assyrian war machine could not be stopped. Siege engines battered down walls, while Assyrian archers rained arrows from above, forcing the people of Samaria into starvation and despair. The city's gates, once the pride of Israel, were finally breached. When Samaria fell in 722 BCE, it marked the end of the northern kingdom, but it was only the beginning of Israel's exile. The siege of Samaria was a monumental event in Israel's history. Assyria's conquest wasn't just about military power, it was about control. Once the city fell, the Assyrians immediately implemented their deportation policies, which involved relocating entire populations to distant corners of the empire. These exiles were not just military prisoners. They were part of Assyria's strategy to disband national identities and create a mosaic empire that could never rise against them again. For the Israelites, this meant the end of their kingdom, their temple, and their legacy. With Samaria's fall, the 10 lost tribes of Israel were exiled, their homes destroyed, their identities shattered. What became of the people of Israel? Did they simply vanish from history, or did they live on in unexpected ways, leaving behind traces that would only be uncovered centuries later? When Sargon II took control of Israel in 722 BCE, he followed in his predecessor's footsteps by enacting his deportation policies, an effective strategy designed to break any potential resistance to Assyrian rule. The Israelites were scattered across the Assyrian Empire, their homes and cities left behind to crumble in the wake of their forced relocation. The 10 lost tribes were scattered far and wide. From Babylonia to Persia, the Israelites were transported, their homes abandoned, their culture submerged. They were deprived of their land, their religious identity, and their history. The Assyrians were meticulous in their efforts to erase the Israelites, placing them in lands far from their own, among other displaced peoples, to ensure they would never regroup. And so, Israel's northern kingdom was lost, leaving behind only the stories of their kings, their temples, and their once proud cities. The deportation of Israel was a cruel and calculated decision by the Assyrians. The 10 lost tribes of Israel, Reuben, Simeon, Zebulun, Issachar, Dan, Naphtali, Gad, Asher, Ephraim, and Manasseh, were forcibly moved to distant lands such as Mesopotamia, Armenia, and Media. Over time, these tribes became assimilated into the Assyrian population, losing their distinct identity and disappearing from the biblical record. This exodus was not just a geographical one but also a cultural erasure, as the Israelites became part of the melting pot of the Assyrian Empire. The 10 lost tribes disappeared from history, but their legacy didn't fade entirely. Traces of their culture, their faith, and their identity were left behind, hidden in the annals of history waiting to be uncovered. Could their story ever be fully understood? Or would the shadows of their disappearance forever linger over the land of Israel? Though Israel as a kingdom was no more, the legacy of the 10 lost tribes lived on. The Bible and archaeological records suggest that remnants of Israel's people may have blended with other groups over the centuries. These displaced peoples eventually became part of modern-day communities, particularly in regions like Turkey, Iraq, and Syria, where their stories have left echoes in the form of cultural practices, language, and traditions. Though the 10 lost tribes may have been forgotten by their own people, history has preserved fragments of their story. Today, some claim to have discovered clues to their whereabouts. In regions such as Iraq, Syria, and Turkey, there are still communities who believe they are the descendants of Israel's lost tribes, practicing unique customs, traditions, and languages that link them back to the ancient Israelites. Could these remnants be the keys to unlocking the mystery of Israel's disappearance? Or have the 10 lost tribes truly vanished into the ether of history, forever lost to time? The exile of Israel and the disappearance of the 10 tribes have sparked intrigue for centuries. Scholars, historians, and even adventurers have sought to uncover the fate of these lost people. From the Afghan Jews to the Beta Israel of Ethiopia, many groups have been claimed to be descendants of the 10 lost tribes. Some even argue that these tribes may have played a role in the spread of Judaism across different regions, as their cultural practices and traditions slowly merged with the people among whom they lived. The fall of Israel was brutal and final, but the legacy of the 10 lost tribes has endured. Their story, though lost to history, is still being written today. Will we ever truly uncover where the remnants of Israel's people went? Or is the mystery of the 10 lost tribes one that will forever be out of reach? When the Babylonian Empire marched on Judah, it wasn't just a kingdom that fell, it was a sacred trust that was broken forever. In the year 609 BCE, the ancient Near East began to witness the rising dominance of Babylon, a kingdom that would soon overshadow Judah and the entire region. Babylon, under King Nebuchadnezzar II, had already begun its ascent as the new imperial power. But this was not just the rise of an empire, it was the unfolding of a transformation that would forever alter the trajectory of the Jewish people. In the wake of Assyria's decline, Babylon emerged as the dominant force in the ancient world. Led by Nebuchadnezzar II, the Babylonians expanded rapidly, conquering territory from Mesopotamia to Syria, and eventually Judah. Yet, it was not just military might that characterized this rise. Babylon was more than a conqueror, it was a force that reshaped cultures, religions, and nations. As Judah stood at the crossroads of this great empire, the fate of its people would soon be sealed. The Babylonian Empire came into power after the fall of Assyria in the late 7th century BCE. By the time Nebuchadnezzar II took the throne in 605 BCE, Babylon had already solidified its status as the preeminent power in the region. Judah, under the weak rule of King Jehoiakim, had been forced to pay tribute to the Babylonians, but their sovereignty was increasingly threatened. As Babylon began to expand westward, Judah found itself caught between the rising Babylonian Empire and its former Egyptian overlords. The question loomed large: could Judah resist the unstoppable force of Babylon, or would it be consumed by the coming storm? As Babylonian forces gathered on the horizon, Judah's future seemed uncertain. Could Judah survive, or would it fall like Israel before it, leaving nothing but ruins and exile? By the time Nebuchadnezzar II launched his final siege on Jerusalem in 586 BCE, Judah was already weakened by years of internal strife and external threats. The kingdom had oscillated between alliances with Egypt and Babylon, never quite securing enough military or diplomatic strength to withstand a full-scale invasion. In the end, Jerusalem, the sacred heart of Judah, would fall under the weight of its own divisions and the might of Babylon. As Babylon's forces encircled Jerusalem in 586 BCE, the people of Judah realized that their kingdom's fate was sealed. The city walls, which had once withstood invasions, were now nothing more than symbols of a crumbling power. As Nebuchadnezzar's army approached, the siege grew more intense. 4 months, the people of Jerusalem fought for survival, starving, desperate, and holding on to what little faith they had left. The Babylonian siege of Jerusalem began after King Jehoiakim's death in 598 BCE, and his son Jehoiakim was taken captive by Nebuchadnezzar II. After a brief revolt in 597 BCE, Jehoiakim's successor, Zedekiah, proved to be a puppet king controlled by Babylon. Yet, in a final desperate bid for independence, Zedekiah sought support from Egypt, which only invited disaster. Nebuchadnezzar responded with a brutal siege. Jeremiah the prophet had long predicted this downfall, calling for surrender, but the king and his officials, steeped in pride, refused to listen. When Babylon finally breached the walls of Jerusalem, it was a death blow not only for the city but for Judah's national identity. The fall of Jerusalem was inevitable, but as the Babylonians tore down the city and its temple, something far more devastating was happening. A cultural erasure was unfolding. Would the people of Judah survive the exile, or would their story be lost forever? The fall of Jerusalem wasn't just a military conquest, it was the shattering of a people's soul. The Babylonian exile, one of the most significant events in Jewish history, marked the forced relocation of the elite of Judah to Babylon. The destruction of the first temple, the dwelling place of God, was not just a physical loss. It was a profound spiritual crisis for the people of Judah. For generations, they had believed that Jerusalem was invincible because it was the home of Yahweh's presence. But with the city's destruction, a new reality dawned on them. No place was safe, and their faith would have to endure in a foreign land. When the Babylonians carried off the elite of Judah, priests, officials, and craftsmen, they didn't just take people, they took identity, culture, and faith. The destruction of the temple, the heart of their religion, sent shockwaves through their consciousness. They were forced to leave everything behind, their homes, their families, and even the land of their ancestors. They arrived in Babylon, a foreign empire with foreign gods, foreign ways, and a foreign culture. How would they survive in a world that had torn apart everything they knew? The Babylonian exile was not a single event, but a series of deportations that took place between 597 BCE and 586 BCE. Nebuchadnezzar II took the elite of Judah, including the royal family, priests, and noblemen, into captivity. This forced migration marked a turning point for the Israelites, as they found themselves in a city full of strangers, under the rule of a king who worshipped gods they had never known. The exile would last for 70 years, and during this time, the Jewish people would undergo a profound spiritual transformation that would influence the development of Judaism for centuries to come. This period of exile also led to the compilation and redaction of many of the Hebrew scriptures, solidifying the Jewish faith in a new way. As the Israelites arrived in Babylon, they were no longer just exiles. They were a people searching for a new identity. Would they hold on to the faith that had defined their kingdom, or would they be lost to the allure of Babylon's gods and customs? The exile would be their greatest test yet. While in Babylon, the Israelites faced a unique challenge, preserving their identity and faith in the face of overwhelming pressure to assimilate into the Babylonian culture. The people of Judah, though physically removed from their homeland, would soon find that their true power lay not in the land of Israel but in the faith they carried with them. During the exile, the Israelites developed the foundational elements of what would become Judaism, marking the beginning of a religious transformation that would forever change the course of history. In the heart of Babylon, surrounded by a culture that was foreign to them, the exiles began to realize that their true strength didn't lie in the temple, the city walls, or the land of Israel. Their strength lay in faith in the covenant with their God. They began to redefine what it meant to be the people of Yahweh, no longer dependent on a physical location, but united in a shared belief and spiritual practice. Synagogues began to form, and the scriptures that had once been scattered pieces of tradition began to be compiled into what we now know as the Hebrew Bible. The exile was not the end of the Israelite people. It was the beginning of a spiritual reawakening. While in Babylon, the Israelites adopted new religious practices that would shape their identity for millennia. The exile led to the development of the Jewish synagogue system, which allowed for worship and community building in the absence of a centralized temple. This period also marked the rise of prophetic literature, as prophets like Ezekiel and Daniel offered words of hope, prophecy, and spiritual guidance for a people in crisis. Judah's survival in Babylon was a triumph of faith, but would the people return to their homeland to rebuild their temple, or would they remain scattered forever, their identity forever shaped by the exile? The Babylonian exile was just the beginning of a profound transformation. And the question remained, would they ever truly return home? The story of ancient Canaan is one of incredible rise, devastating fall, and remarkable survival. It's a story woven into the fabric of time, a land that birthed some of the earliest civilizations in human history, from the bustling city-states of Jericho and Hazor to the religious heart of Jerusalem. This narrow strip of land, nestled between the mighty rivers of Egypt and the fertile crescent of Mesopotamia, became the stage where some of the world's first empires rose and fell, and where the birth of monotheism forever changed the course of human civilization. From the Sea People's destructive invasions to the monumental rise of Israel, Judah, and their eventual collapse under the Babylonians, this land is defined by a constant clash of cultures, the inevitable cycles of conflict, and, remarkably, survival, against overwhelming odds. It's a land of monumental achievement, the construction of the first fortified cities, the rise of an empire in Israel under David and Solomon, and the birth of religious traditions that would later reverberate throughout the world. Yet it is also a land marked by tragic loss. The fall of Israel to the Assyrians, the destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians, and the exile that scattered the 10 tribes to the far corners of the empire. It's the land where gods and faiths collided, where the Canaanite pantheon gave way to the monotheistic beliefs of Judaism, and where temples fell only to be replaced by the seeds of a spiritual resilience that would endure through exile and diaspora. The enduring question of whether the land itself was cursed, or whether its people simply had the tenacity to survive against overwhelming adversity, lingers in the stories that continue to be passed down. But perhaps the most profound aspect of Canaan's legacy lies in the cultural convergence and religious transformation that took place there. This was not just a land of conquerors and kingdoms, but a crucible where ideas, languages, and faiths blended, clashed, and transformed. From the rise of the Hebrews, who would go on to shape the Judeo-Christian traditions, to the influence of Egyptian, Mesopotamian, and Phoenician cultures on the region, Canaan became a melting pot of civilizations, a place where cultural exchange was as inevitable as war. The fertile lands, with their agriculture and trade routes, made it a hub of commerce and a focal point for cultural and religious diffusion, not just among neighboring empires, but across the Mediterranean world. These interactions gave rise to an ever-evolving identity, shaped by those who came before and after. Yet, despite the constant threats, from the Assyrians and Babylonians to the Egyptians and the Philistines, the legacy of Canaan did not die with its cities. The rise of Judah's faith in the face of exile, the rebuilding of Jerusalem after the return from Babylonian captivity, and the eventual spread of Judaism through centuries of hardship reveal a legacy of survival. The faith that was born in these ancient hills, streets, and temples would become a cornerstone for much of the world's religious history, from the destruction of the first temple to the eventual rise of Christianity and later Islam, all of which can trace their roots back to the cultural and spiritual transformations that took place here. This documentary doesn't just tell the story of the kingdoms of ancient Canaan. It delves into the foundational themes of identity, conflict, and legacy that have shaped human history for millennia. The question of what it means to survive in a world where cultures and empires constantly shift, where the tension between tradition and innovation shapes not just kings and armies, but peoples and religions, is a theme that resonates today. The destruction and rebirth of Canaan's cities, the shifting of power and belief, is not just a story of the past. It is a reflection of the forces that have continued to define human civilization. The cultural imprint of Canaan, the intersection of faith, power, and endurance, remains a foundational narrative for the modern world. From Jerusalem, which continues to hold spiritual significance for millions, to the people whose ancestors walked these ancient streets, the echoes of Canaan's rise and fall resonate through the centuries. The ruins may still stand, but the stories, legends, and lessons of Canaan endure, reminding us that even in the face of near annihilation, culture and faith have the power to survive, transform, and shape the world for generations to come. As we close this exploration into the land that gave birth to much of the world's religious and cultural heritage, we ask, what can we learn from the rise, fall, and transformation of ancient Canaan? How have the struggles for identity, survival, and faith in this land shaped our understanding of conflict and legacy in the modern world? Canaan's story may be ancient, but its resilience, transformation, and enduring impact on the world are as relevant as ever. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey through the rise, fall, and legacy of ancient Canaan. From the clash of empires to the survival of faith, we've explored a story that shaped the world as we know it today. If you've enjoyed this deep dive into one of history's most transformative regions, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this documentary. Your support helps us continue to uncover the hidden stories of our past. And to those who've stayed with us until the end, thank you for your curiosity, your passion for history, and your commitment to discovering the untold stories of our ancestors. If you haven't subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? Stay with us as we continue to bring you more untold tales of history, and make sure you're part of the journey. If you have any thoughts, questions, or insights, drop them in the comments below. We'd love to hear your thoughts on this incredible story. Until next time, keep seeking knowledge and don't let the past remain forgotten.